In the vast expanse of the Andromeda sector, where plasma cannons decide diplomacy and entire civilizations rise and fall in solar cycles, one truth has remained constant for millennia: strength determines survival. The Kithaeron Empire, with their towering 8-foot frames, razor-sharp claws, and bones harder than refined titanium, have never met their match in combat. But, today, everything changes. When Commander Zareth first laid eyes on the strange, pink-skinned creature standing barely 6 feet tall, with no visible weapons, no armor plating, and soft flesh that seemed vulnerable to even the slightest breeze, she couldn't help but laugh. How did such a pathetic species even survive long enough to develop space travel? She was about to discover that appearances in the galaxy can be devastatingly deceiving. This is the story of humanity's first contact with an empire that measured worth by battle prowess, and how one human soldier would shatter every assumption about what true strength really means. Some lessons are learned through words and wisdom. Others are written in blood and starfire. Prepare yourself for a tale that will redefine everything you thought you knew about the power that lies within the human spirit. The Crimson Sons of HFY Prime cast long shadows across the crystalline command deck of the Kithaeron dreadnought Bloodfang. Commander Zareth stood before the massive viewport, her 8-foot frame imposing even by Kithaeron standards. Her deep purple skin bore the ritual scars of 100 victories, each mark telling the story of another species that had fallen before the might of the Empire. Her forearms moved with practiced efficiency as she reviewed the tactical displays floating before her, while her predatory eyes studied the small vessel that had appeared at the edge of their sensor range. "Commander," growled her second-in-command, Thexkar, his voice rumbling through the bridge like distant thunder. "The unknown vessel continues to broadcast on multiple frequencies. Their message remains the same." He paused, his mandibles clicking in what passed for amusement among their kind. "They claim to represent something called humanity and request peaceful first contact." Zareth's laugh was a sound like breaking glass mixed with the roar of a predator. In the 3 centuries since she had first taken up arms for the Empire, she had heard similar claims from dozens of species. They all spoke of peace, of mutual benefit, of cooperation. They all ended up as smoking debris or cowering subjects of Kithaeron rule. The strong conquered, the weak served or died. This was the way of the universe, unchanged since the first Kithaeron had lifted a blade in anger. "Show me this vessel again," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of one who had never known defeat. The main display shifted, magnifying the image of the human ship. It was laughably small compared to the Bloodfang, roughly the size of one of their shuttle bays. Its hull was a dull gray metal, unmarked by the battle scars that would indicate a warrior race. No visible weapons systems, no armor plating that would suggest they understood the realities of galactic politics. If anything, it looked more like a cargo hauler than a military vessel. "They're either incredibly brave or impossibly stupid," Thexkar observed, his 4 eyes focusing on different aspects of the ship's design. "Perhaps both. Scan for weapons, defensive systems, anything that might explain how such a pathetic species survived long enough to build starships," Zareth ordered. The bridge crew worked with mechanical precision, their claws dancing over control surfaces that would have been impossibly complex for most other species. The Kithaerons had not conquered half the galaxy through luck or diplomacy. They had done it through superior technology, unmatched physical prowess, and an understanding of warfare that was written into their very DNA. "Scans complete, Commander," reported the weapons officer, her voice carrying a note of confusion. "The vessel shows minimal defensive capabilities. Some kind of energy shielding, but nothing that would stop even our lightest weapons. We detect what appears to be a small kinetic weapon system, probably designed for clearing space debris. No plasma cannons, no quantum torpedoes, no antimatter warheads. They're not even trying to appear threatening," mused Zareth. "Either they're complete fools, or this is some kind of elaborate trap." She had seen trap ships before, vessels that appeared weak and helpless until they revealed hidden weapon systems that could gut a dreadnought. But her sensors were among the most advanced in the galaxy, capable of detecting weapon signatures through the most sophisticated shielding. If this human ship was armed with anything more dangerous than a navigation laser, her instruments would have found it. "Commander, they're requesting permission to dock," reported the communications officer. "They say they have a diplomatic envoy aboard who wishes to speak with our leadership." The bridge fell silent except for the low hum of the ship's systems. In all their years of conquest, the Kitharans had never encountered a species that approached them with such apparent naivety. Most civilizations at least attempted to appear strong, to project military power even when they possessed none. These humans seemed content to appear as defenseless as newborn prey animals. Grant their request, Zara-TH decided. But, maintain full battle readiness. Deploy security teams to the docking bay. If this is a trick, I want to be ready to turn their ship into scrap metal in seconds. You're actually going to let them board? Thexgar asked, his tone suggesting he thought his commander might have finally lost her tactical edge. I'm curious, she replied, her predatory smile revealing teeth that could tear through battle armor. It's been years since we've encountered a new species. Even longer since we've found one that doesn't immediately understand its place in the galactic hierarchy. Perhaps we can learn something useful before we decide whether to enslave them or simply exterminate them. The next hour passed in tense preparation. The Bloodfang's corridors filled with the sound of marching feet as security teams took their positions. Weapon systems came online, their targeting computers cycling through warm-up procedures. In the docking bay, a full squad of Kitharan warriors waited, their massive frames encased in powered armor that could withstand direct hits from plasma rifles. When the human shuttle finally docked, it did so with the same apparent lack of concern for protocol that had marked their entire approach. No escort fighters, no obvious attempt to scan the dreadnought for weaknesses, no preparation for combat. The airlock cycled with a soft hiss, and the first human stepped aboard a Kitharan vessel. Zara-TH watched through the security feeds as the human emerged into the docking bay, and her first reaction was a mixture of amusement and disbelief. The creature was even smaller than their scans had suggested, barely reaching the chest height of the shortest Kitharan warrior. Its skin was a pale pink color that looked impossibly fragile, unmarked by scars or the natural armor plating that any sensible evolution would have provided. Its limbs were thin, almost delicate, and it moved with none of the predatory grace that marked a true warrior. But what truly amazed her was its complete lack of fear. The human walked into the docking bay surrounded by creatures that could have torn it apart with their bare hands, each one armed and armored for war, and its expression remained calm. Not the blank calm of shock or the desperate calm of someone trying to hide their terror, but the genuine calm of someone who felt no threat from the situation. Either this creature is the greatest actor in the galaxy, she murmured to herself, or it truly doesn't understand what it's looking at. The human was dressed in what appeared to be some kind of formal uniform, dark blue with small metallic insignia that probably indicated rank within their society. It carried no visible weapons, wore no armor, and seemed content to trust its life to the goodwill of beings it had never met before. I am Captain James Morrison of the United Earth Alliance, the human announced, its voice carrying clearly through the bay despite its small size. I come seeking peaceful dialogue and the establishment of diplomatic relations between our species. The translation systems made quick work of the alien language, converting the sounds into something the Kitharans could understand. But the meaning was almost as alien as the words themselves. Seeking peaceful dialogue with a species that could obviously destroy them without effort? Either these humans had military forces elsewhere that they were counting on for protection, or they were operating under delusions that would have been amusing if they weren't so pathetically naive. Commander, came Thexgar's voice over the private channel, shall we bring it to the interrogation chambers? A few hours with the mind probe should tell us everything we need to know about their species and their capabilities. Zara-TH considered the suggestion. It would certainly be the most efficient approach, and it would spare her the tedium of pretending to care about diplomatic niceties. But something about the human's behavior intrigued her. In all her years of conquest, she had never encountered a species that approached first contact with such apparent confidence despite such obvious weakness. No, she decided. Have them brought to Conference Chamber 7. Full security escort, but treat them as a diplomatic envoy for now. I want to hear what they have to say before we decide their fate. You're actually going to negotiate with them? The surprise in Thexgar's voice was obvious. I'm going to satisfy my curiosity, she corrected. Then, we'll see how much of a fight they can put up when they realize how the galaxy really works. 20 minutes later, Zara-TH entered the conference chamber to find the human seated at one end of the massive metal table, apparently unconcerned by the fact that he was surrounded by enough firepower to level a city. The security team had maintained their positions at the room's perimeter, their weapons powered but not openly threatening. Standard protocol for dealing with unknown species, though in this case it seemed like unnecessary caution. Captain Morrison, she said, settling her massive frame into the chair at the opposite end of the table. The furniture had been designed for Kitharan physiology, and she towered over the human even while seated. I am Commander Zara Th of the Kitharan Imperial Navy. You have requested dialogue. I am prepared to listen, for now. The human showed no reaction to her size or to the obvious threat implied in her words. Instead, he reached into his uniform jacket and withdrew a small device that he placed on the table between them. Thank you for agreeing to meet, Commander, he said, activating the device. This is a cultural exchange database containing information about human civilization, our history, our values, and our hopes for peaceful coexistence with other sapient species. Zara Th stared at the device, then at the human, then back at the device. You're offering us information about your species. Freely. Without any guarantee that we won't use that information to conquer you more efficiently. Yes, Morrison replied simply. We believe that understanding leads to friendship, and friendship leads to peace. We've found that transparency and honesty are the best foundations for any relationship, whether between individuals or between civilizations. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft humming of the ship's environmental systems. Zara Th had heard many things in her centuries of military service, but never anything quite so naive. This human was literally handing over intelligence that could be used to destroy his entire species, and he seemed to think he was being diplomatic. Captain Morrison, she said, her voice carefully controlled, do you understand the nature of the Kitharan Empire? Do you comprehend what we have done to the dozens of species we have encountered before yours? We have some information from our scouts and long-range sensors, Morrison replied. We know you control a significant portion of this galactic region. We know you have advanced military technology. We know you've had conflicts with other species in the past. But we also believe that the past doesn't have to determine the future. Conflicts, Zara Th repeated, her voice flat. We have conquered, enslaved, or exterminated every species we have encountered. We have turned entire star systems into slave colonies. We have reduced civilizations older than yours to ash and memory. And you call these conflicts? For the first time since entering the chamber, Morrison's expression shifted slightly. Not to fear, as she had expected, but to something that looked almost like sadness. Then, you've never experienced what we call peace, he said quietly. You've never known what it's like to share knowledge instead of taking it, to build together instead of tearing down, to see another species as friends instead of enemies. Because peace is weakness, Zara Th growled. The universe rewards the strong and crushes the weak. Your species obviously doesn't understand this, or you wouldn't have come here defenseless and naive, expecting friendship from those who have no concept of mercy. Morrison leaned forward slightly, and, for just a moment, something flickered in his eyes that Zara Th couldn't quite identify. Not fear, not anger, but something else. Something that made her instincts whisper a warning she didn't understand. Commander, he said, his voice still calm but carrying a weight that hadn't been there before, we didn't come here defenseless. We came here hopeful. There's a difference, though I suspect your species hasn't learned to recognize it yet. Before she could respond to that cryptic statement, alarms began wailing throughout the ship. Emergency lights bathed the conference chamber in pulsing red, and Thexgar's voice crackled over the communication system. Commander, we have multiple contacts dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. Unknown configuration, but they're big. Very big. And they're heading this way fast. Morrison's expression didn't change, but he reached over and calmly deactivated the cultural exchange device. I should probably mention, he said conversationally, that our diplomatic protocol includes a safety provision. If our envoy doesn't check in every 2 hours, our escort fleet assumes the negotiations have gone badly. Zara Th felt something cold settle in her stomach as the implications hit her. Escort fleet. Oh yes, Morrison said, his voice still maddeningly calm. We really do want peace, Commander. But we've learned that sometimes you have to be prepared to fight for it. The human who had seemed so weak, so naive, so laughably unprepared for the realities of galactic politics, smiled. And, in that smile, Zara-Th finally recognized the thing she had seen flickering in his eyes. It was pity. The tactical display in the Bloodfang's command center painted a picture that made even Zara-Th's battle-hardened crew shift uneasily at their stations. 17 contacts had emerged from hyperspace, each one broadcasting energy signatures that defied easy classification. The largest vessels registered as nearly 3 times the mass of the Bloodfang, while even the smallest appeared to be heavily armed cruisers that could pose a serious threat to Kitharan destroyers. Analysis, Zara-Th barked as she strode onto the bridge, Captain Morrison walking calmly beside her. The human had insisted on accompanying her, claiming it would help facilitate communication between the fleets. She had allowed it partly out of curiosity and partly because having a hostage might prove useful in the coming confrontation. 17 vessels in total, reported the sensor officer, his 4 hands dancing over his controls as data streamed across his displays. 5 appear to be battleships of unknown configuration, 8 heavy cruisers, and 4 vessels that our computers can't properly classify. They're using some kind of adaptive shielding that's interfering with our deep scans. Weapon signatures, she demanded. That's where it gets interesting, Commander. We're detecting energy readings consistent with plasma cannons, but the power signatures are off the scale. Whatever they're using as ammunition, it's not standard antimatter. The quantum torpedo tubes are using a completely different targeting system than anything in our databases. And there are weapon systems we can't even identify. Morrison stood quietly beside the captain's chair, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the tactical display. His expression remained neutral, but Zara-Th noticed he showed no surprise at the readings her crew was reporting. He had known exactly what was coming. Captain Morrison, she said, her voice dangerously low, I suggest you contact your fleet and inform them that any aggressive action will result in your immediate death and the destruction of their vessels. The Kitharan Empire does not negotiate from a position of weakness. Commander, Morrison replied, his tone still infuriatingly calm, my fleet isn't here to threaten you. They're here to ensure I return home safely. However, I should point out that threatening to kill a diplomatic envoy is generally considered an act of war by most civilized species. Most civilized species understand that strength determines survival, Zara-Th growled. Your people seem to have missed that lesson. Actually, we learned it very well, Morrison said quietly. We just learned it differently than you did. Before she could ask what he meant by that, the communications officer interrupted. Commander, we're receiving a transmission from the human fleet. They're requesting to speak with their envoy. Put it through, Zara-Th ordered. The main display shifted to show the bridge of what was obviously the human flagship. The figure that appeared on screen was another human, this one wearing a different uniform with more ornate insignia. Like Morrison, he appeared deceptively fragile by Kitharan standards, but there was something in his eyes that reminded Zara-Th of seasoned predators. Captain Morrison, the human on screen said, this is Admiral Chen. Status report. Negotiations are ongoing, Admiral, Morrison replied smoothly. Commander Zara-Th and her people are taking time to consider our proposals for peaceful coexistence. I see, Chen said, though his gaze had shifted to focus on Zara-Th herself. Commander, I am Admiral David Chen of the United Earth Alliance 5th Fleet. I trust Captain Morrison has been treated with appropriate diplomatic courtesy? The question was polite, but there was steel underneath the words that Zara-Th recognized. This was a warrior speaking to another warrior, using the language of diplomacy to avoid saying what they both understood. Your envoy is unharmed, she replied carefully. Though I must point out that bringing a military fleet to a diplomatic meeting suggests your people understand the realities of power better than your captain initially implied. Chen's smile was thin. Captain Morrison is one of our most skilled diplomats, Commander. But he's also a veteran of the Proxima campaign, the Battle of Wolf 359, and the liberation of Kepler 442. We don't send our people into dangerous situations unprepared. The casual mention of battles and campaigns sent a chill through the bridge crew. This human, the small, soft-looking creature they had dismissed as harmless, was a veteran warrior? The idea seemed absurd, but the respect in Admiral Chen's voice was unmistakable. Commander, Thexgar's voice came over the private channel, we're detecting movement among their fleet. 3 vessels are changing position, moving to flank our current location. Zara TH's predatory instincts flared to full alert. The humans were maneuvering for combat while maintaining the pretense of diplomatic discussion. It was a tactic she had used herself many times, but she had never been on the receiving end. "Admiral Chen," she said, her voice carrying a clear warning, "I notice your ships are moving into attack positions. Perhaps you should reconsider before making a mistake that costs lives on both sides." "Commander," Chen replied, his tone still diplomatically neutral, "my ships are simply assuming standard defensive positions. We've learned that it's important to be prepared for misunderstandings during first contact situations." The word misunderstandings hung in the air like a threat wrapped in silk. These humans were playing a game Zara TH recognized, speaking in diplomatic language while maneuvering for military advantage. But they were doing it with a skill that suggested considerable experience with exactly this type of situation. "Captain Morrison," she said, turning to the human beside her, "your people seem very familiar with military tactics for a species that claims to seek only peace." Morrison's expression grew thoughtful, almost sad. "Commander, there's something your people need to understand about humans. We don't want to fight. We never want to fight. But that doesn't mean we don't know how." "Explain." "We spent most of our early history at war with each other," Morrison said simply. "Thousands of years of conflict, from primitive weapons to weapons that could destroy entire continents. We learned every possible way to kill, to conquer, to destroy. We got very, very good at it." He paused, looking out at the tactical display showing the two fleets facing each other across the darkness of space. "But then, we learned something else," he continued. "We learned what we were losing by constantly fighting. We learned the cost of victory, the price of conquest, the weight of all the things we destroyed in the name of survival. So we made a choice. We chose to be better than what we were capable of being." "That sounds like weakness talking," Zara TH said, though something in his words made her uneasy. "Does it?" Morrison asked. "Tell me, Commander, in all your centuries of conquest, how many friends has your empire made? How many species celebrate when they hear the Kitharan name? How many civilizations have offered to share their knowledge, their art, their discoveries with you freely?" The questions hit harder than physical blows. In all her years of service, Zara TH had never encountered a species that welcomed the Kitharans. Fear, hatred, desperate submission, but never friendship. Never genuine cooperation. "Friendship doesn't win battles," she said, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "You're right," Morrison agreed. "Friendship doesn't win battles. But it prevents them from happening in the first place. And when battles do become necessary, friends fight harder for each other than slaves ever fight for their masters." "Commander," the tactical officer interrupted, "the human vessels are powering up their weapon systems. Energy readings are climbing beyond our sensors' measurement capacity." On the display, Admiral Chen's expression hadn't changed, but there was something in his eyes now that Zara TH recognized from her own reflection during combat. The look of someone preparing to do violence not out of anger or hatred, but out of cold, professional necessity. "Commander Zara TH," Chen said, his diplomatic tone slipping slightly, "I'm going to be very direct with you now. My people came here hoping to make friends. We brought gifts of knowledge, offers of cooperation, and dreams of peace between our species. But we also brought the Fifth Fleet, because we've learned that some civilizations only understand one language." "You think your 17 ships can defeat the Kitharan Empire?" Zara TH asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer wasn't as simple as she wanted it to be. "I think," Chen said carefully, "that you've never fought humans before. And I think you're about to learn why that matters." The sensors suddenly screamed a warning that made everyone on the bridge freeze. The human fleet wasn't just powering up weapons anymore. They were doing something that shouldn't have been possible. "Commander," the sensor officer reported, his voice tight with disbelief, "they're charging some kind of gravimetric weapon. The energy signature is unlike anything in our databases. They're literally manipulating spacetime around their vessels." Morrison noticed her shocked expression and offered another of his unsettling smiles. "You know, Commander, humans have always been very good at making tools. We started with sharpened sticks and worked our way up from there. Give us a few thousand years and access to advanced physics, and we tend to get creative. "You're bluffing," Zara-TH said, but her certainty was cracking. "No species develops weapons that advanced without first conquering others to fuel their research." "We didn't conquer others," Morrison replied. "We convinced them to help us." Turns out, when you approach other species as potential friends instead of future subjects, they're remarkably willing to share knowledge and resources. Amazing what you can accomplish when everyone's working toward the same goal. The implications of that statement hit her like a physical blow. These humans hadn't developed their technology through conquest and forced labor. They had developed it through cooperation, through willing collaboration with other species. It was a concept so foreign to Kitharin thinking that she had trouble processing it. The Altarian quantum physicists were particularly helpful, Morrison continued conversationally. "Brilliant people, once you get to know them. They were so grateful when we helped them relocate after their sun went nova that they shared their most advanced research freely." "The gravimetric manipulation technology you're detecting? That was a joint human-Altarian project." Commander Thexkar's urgent voice broke through her shock. "We're detecting hyperspace signatures throughout the system. Multiple fleets are dropping out of FTL." The tactical display exploded with new contacts as ship after ship materialized around them. But these weren't human vessels. These were dozens of different ship designs, representing species Zara-TH didn't recognize, all taking positions alongside the human fleet. "Admiral Chen," came a new voice over the communication system, "this one clearly not human. This is Fleet Commander 6 then, of the Ophidian Defense Force. The 3rd Combined Fleet is in position and ready to assist." "This is Warsinger Crothmole of the Ursine Battle Fleet," rumbled another voice. "The Ursine people stand with our human allies." More voices followed, species after species announcing their presence and their readiness to fight alongside humanity. Zara-TH watched in growing disbelief as the tactical display showed over 60 vessels from at least a dozen different civilizations, all apparently willing to risk their lives for these small, soft creatures who claimed to want only peace. "You see, Commander," Morrison said quietly, "we learned something your empire never did. We learned that true strength doesn't come from making others fear you. It comes from making others willing to stand with you when things get difficult." The reality of the situation finally penetrated Zara-TH's warrior pride. The Blood Fawn was outnumbered 20-1, surrounded by species using technology she didn't recognize, facing weapons she couldn't counter. For the first time in her 3 centuries of military service, she was looking at certain defeat. But what shook her to her core wasn't the tactical situation. It was the realization that these humans had achieved something the Kitharin Empire, with all its military might and conquests, had never managed. They had made friends willing to die for them. The silence on the bridge of the Bloodfang stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the soft beeping of sensors struggling to catalog the overwhelming array of firepower now arrayed against them. Zara-TH stared at the tactical display, her predatory mind automatically calculating angles of attack, escape routes, and the probability of survival. Every calculation ended the same way: annihilation. But what disturbed her more than the tactical situation was the growing realization that she had fundamentally misunderstood everything about these humans from the moment they had appeared in her sensor range. This wasn't just a military miscalculation. This was a failure of imagination so complete that it challenged everything she thought she knew about the nature of power itself. "Commander," Morrison said quietly, drawing her attention back to the small figure beside her command chair. "Admiral Chen is waiting for your response. I should point out that this doesn't have to end in violence. We still hope it won't." "Hope," Zara-TH repeated, the word feeling strange on her tongue. "You're surrounded by enough firepower to glass a planet, and you still talk about hope." "Yes," Morrison replied simply. "Because despite everything your people have done, despite all the civilizations you've conquered and enslaved, we still believe you can choose to be better than what you've been." "Choose to be better," she mused, her 4 hands unconsciously flexing as if reaching for weapons that weren't there. "You speak as if the strong have an obligation to the weak." "Don't we?" Morrison asked, and the genuine curiosity in his voice made her pause. "If you have the power to help others instead of harming them, if you have the strength to protect instead of conquer, doesn't that create a responsibility?" The question was so alien to Kitharin thinking that Zara-TH initially dismissed it as the philosophical rambling of a species too weak to understand reality. But something about the way Morrison asked it, the complete sincerity in his voice, made her actually consider the concept. The strong survive, she said, repeating the fundamental truth that had guided Kitharan civilization for millennia. The weak serve or die. This is the law of nature, unchanged since the first predator caught the first prey. Is it? Morrison challenged gently. Or is that just the law you chose to follow because it was easier than finding another way? Before she could formulate a response, the communications officer interrupted with obvious reluctance. Commander, we're receiving priority transmissions from Imperial Command. They're demanding an immediate status report. Zaratich's stomach clenched. She had been so focused on the immediate tactical situation that she had forgotten about the broader implications. The Bloodfawn had been on a routine patrol mission when they had encountered the human ship. By now, her failure to report in would have triggered alarm protocols throughout the Imperial fleet. Within hours, every Kitharan vessel within a dozen star systems would be converging on this location. Admiral Chen, she said, turning back to the main display, you should know that this vessel's failure to report will bring the full might of the Kitharan Imperial Navy to this system. Whatever advantage you think you have will be meaningless when faced with 300 dreadnoughts and their escort fleets. Chen's expression didn't change, but she caught a slight tightening around his eyes. How long before they arrive? 6 hours, perhaps 8 if we're fortunate with hyperspace conditions, she replied honestly. Admiral, Morrison interjected, perhaps this would be a good time to contact the diplomatic corps. They'll want to know about this development. Something cold settled in Zaratich's chest as she realized the implications of that casual comment. These humans hadn't just prepared for the possibility of encountering her single ship. They had prepared for the possibility of encountering the entire Kitharan fleet. Captain Morrison, she said slowly, exactly how long have your people been aware of the Kitharan Empire? Morrison's expression grew thoughtful, almost regretful. About 3 years, Commander. We've been monitoring your expansion into this sector, studying your tactics, your technology, your civilization. We've been hoping that when we finally made contact, we could find a way to coexist peacefully. 3 years, she repeated, the timeline clicking into place in her mind. You've been watching us for 3 years, and you still thought peace was possible? We always think peace is possible, Morrison said simply. Right up until the moment we're forced to accept that it isn't. The communications board lit up with another priority signal, this one carrying the encryption codes of the Imperial High Command itself. Zaratich hesitated, knowing that answering would force her to report a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her control. Failing to answer would be even worse, marking her as either dead or traitorous in the eyes of her superiors. Commander, Thexkar said over the private channel, we're detecting massive hyperspace disturbances at the edge of the system. Whatever's coming, it's big. Very big. The tactical display updated to show new contacts dropping out of hyperspace, but these weren't Kitharan vessels. These were human ships, dozens of them, each one massive beyond anything she had seen before. The energy signatures were so intense that her sensors initially registered them as stellar phenomena rather than artificial constructs. Admiral Chen, Morrison said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction, I see the 8th Fleet has arrived on schedule. Right on time, Chen confirmed. Commander Zaratich, I'd like you to meet Admiral Sarah Rodriguez of the UEA 8th Fleet. She specializes in what we call diplomatic support operations. The main display split to show another human, this one a woman with graying hair and eyes that held the cold calculation of someone who had seen too much war. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Commander Zaratich, Rodriguez said, I am Admiral Rodriguez. I understand you've been having a discussion with Captain Morrison about the future relationship between our species. Your fleet positioning suggests the discussion may be reaching its conclusion, Zaratich replied, falling back on the formal military courtesy that seemed to be the only common ground between their species. That depends entirely on you, Rodriguez said bluntly. We know about the Kitharan reinforcements heading this way. We know about the 3 Imperial battle groups that have been mobilizing in the Rigel sector. We know about the slave labor camps on Kepler 186c and the genocide you committed on Proxima Centauri b. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. The humans knew about classified military deployments, about off-the-books operations, about atrocities that even most Kitharans didn't know had happened. The intelligence-gathering operation implied by such knowledge was staggering in scope. "We know everything," Commander Rodriguez continued. "And we've decided that the time for hoping you'll choose to be better has passed. So now you get to make a different choice. Which is, surrender your vessel and submit to escort to a neutral system where we can discuss the terms of Kitharan integration into the galactic community," Rodriguez said. "Or fight us here and discover why species that cooperate instead of conquer develop better weapons." Morrison stepped closer to Zara-TH's command chair, his expression genuinely sympathetic. "Commander, I want you to understand something. Everything we've shown you today, all these fleets and weapons and technologies, we built them not because we wanted to conquer anyone, but because we were afraid of having to use them. We prepared for war so thoroughly because we desperately wanted to avoid it." "That makes no sense," Zara-TH protested. "If you have the power to conquer, why wouldn't you use it?" "Because," Morrison said quietly, "we remember what it was like when we did use it. We remember the cost, the waste, the loss of everything that makes life worth living. We decided that being able to destroy something doesn't mean you should." The philosophical argument was interrupted by another urgent alert from the sensor station. "Commander, the Imperial reinforcement fleet is dropping out of hyperspace at the system's edge. 247 vessels, including the dreadnought Conquest with Admiral Thrackmore commanding." Zara-TH felt a mixture of relief and dread. Admiral Thrackmore was one of the Empire's most accomplished fleet commanders, a warrior whose tactical brilliance was matched only by his ruthless efficiency. If anyone could break the human blockade, it would be him. But she also knew what his arrival meant for any hope of avoiding a massacre. "Admiral Rodriguez," she said, "whatever you think you know about Kitharan military capabilities, Admiral Thrackmore represents the best we have to offer. He has never lost a battle. Never retreated from an engagement. If you force him to fight, the system will become a graveyard for both our species." "Actually," Morrison said, consulting a small device he pulled from his pocket, "Admiral Thrackmore is currently about to receive some very interesting information about human capabilities. Information that should give him pause." As if summoned by his words, the communications board lit up with an incoming transmission from the Imperial fleet. Admiral Thrackmore's image appeared on screen, his massive frame imposing even through the video link. His scarred features showed the controlled fury of a predator that had discovered its prey was more dangerous than expected. "Commander Zara-TH," he growled, "explain to me why my sensors are showing over 300 alien vessels in this system, all of them targeting my fleet with weapons I don't recognize." "Admiral," Zara-TH began, but Morrison stepped forward before she could continue. "Admiral Thrackmore," the human said, his voice carrying none of the deference one would expect when addressing such a formidable opponent, "my name is Captain James Morrison, representing the United Earth Alliance. I believe we have some things to discuss." The silence that followed was so complete that Zara-TH could hear her own heartbeat. Admiral Thrackmore stared at the small human figure on his screen, and she could see him struggling with the same cognitive dissonance she had experienced. How could something so apparently weak command such respect, such power, such unwavering confidence? "Human," Thrackmore finally said, his voice carefully controlled, "you will surrender immediately or face the consequences of opposing the Kitharan Empire." Morrison's response was a smile that somehow managed to be both sympathetic and absolutely terrifying. "Admiral," he said quietly, "I think you misunderstand the situation. We're not opposing the Kitharan Empire. We're offering to help it evolve into something better. The question is whether you're wise enough to accept that offer." The next few minutes unfolded with the terrible inevitability of an avalanche. Admiral Thrackmore's response to Morrison's offer was exactly what Zara-TH had expected from the Empire's most ruthless commander. His laughter was a sound like grinding metal, devoid of humor and full of predatory anticipation. "Evolve?" Thrackmore repeated, his scarred features twisted into a snarl. "The Kitharan Empire has evolved, human. We have evolved beyond the weaknesses that plague lesser species. We have evolved beyond mercy, beyond doubt, beyond the pathetic need to justify our strength to those too weak to challenge it." Morrison's expression grew sad, the look of someone who had hoped for a different outcome but had prepared for this one. Admiral, I was hoping you would be wiser than your reputation suggested. Unfortunately, it appears that reputation was accurate. Wisdom? Thrackmore's voice rose to a roar that echoed through the bridge speakers. I will show you wisdom, creature. I will show you what 3 centuries of conquest have taught the Kitharan people about dealing with upstart species who mistake technology for strength. The tactical display erupted into chaos as the Imperial fleet began its attack run. 247 Kitharan warships, the accumulated might of half a dozen conquered star systems, accelerated toward the human coalition with the coordinated precision that had made them the terror of the galaxy. But, instead of the expected response, the human and allied fleets simply waited. They maintained their positions, their weapons powered but not firing, as if they were content to let the Kitharans come to them. Admiral Rodriguez, Morrison said calmly into his communicator, I believe we've reached the point where words are no longer sufficient. Understood, Captain, came Rodriguez's reply. All fleet commanders, this is Admiral Rodriguez. Execute Protocol 7. Show them what humans can do when we stop being polite. What happened next challenged everything Zara-TH thought she knew about space warfare. The human vessels didn't accelerate to meet the Kitharan charge. Instead, they simply vanished. Not the controlled shimmer of cloaking technology, not the energy distortion of hyperspace jumps, but actual instantaneous translocation from one point in space to another. One moment the human fleet was holding position at the edge of the system. The next moment, they were scattered throughout the Kitharan formation, having appeared inside the Empire's defensive perimeter as if space itself had folded to deliver them there. Impossible, Thrackmore snarled over the communication link. No species has that level of spatial manipulation technology. Actually, Morrison said conversationally, several species have it. The crystalline entities of the Magellanic Clouds developed it about 50,000 years ago. The problem is that it requires a level of cooperative thought and shared consciousness that most species can't achieve. Most species are too busy competing with each other to develop the trust necessary for true collective action. The tactical display showed the result of humanity's sudden repositioning. Every Kitharan vessel found itself surrounded by human and allied ships, their formation broken, their tactical advantage neutralized. But Thrackmore was too experienced a commander to be paralyzed by surprise. All ships, engage the enemy, he ordered. Show these creatures why the Empire has never been defeated. The space around the Bloodfang exploded into violence as the 2 fleets opened fire. Kitharan plasma cannons, weapons that could melt through meter-thick armor plating, lanced out toward their targets. Quantum torpedoes, each one carrying enough antimatter to vaporize a city, streaked through the darkness toward human hulls. And accomplished exactly nothing. The human ships didn't dodge the incoming fire. They didn't attempt to outmaneuver the Kitharan weapons. They simply absorbed them. Plasma bolts that should have carved through their hulls dissipated harmlessly against shields that converted the energy into harmless radiation. Quantum torpedoes that should have torn them apart were caught in gravitational fields that compressed the explosions into tiny, contained singularities that winked out of existence without causing damage. Commander, the weapons officer reported, his voice tight with disbelief, our weapons are having no effect. Their shielding is absorbing everything we can throw at them. But the humans weren't content to simply defend. Their return fire was devastating in its precision and efficiency. Instead of the brute force approach favored by most military species, human weapons seemed designed to disable rather than destroy. Targeted electromagnetic pulses knocked out Kitharan weapon systems without breaching hulls. Gravimetric mines created localized space distortions that prevented ships from maneuvering without actually damaging them. Quantum field generators surrounded individual vessels in bubbles of altered spacetime that made it impossible for them to fire their weapons or communicate with the rest of the fleet. Within minutes, the pride of the Kitharan Empire was reduced to a collection of helpless metal shells drifting in space, their crews unharmed but completely unable to continue fighting. Thrackmore to all ships, the Admiral's voice crackled over the communications system, strain evident despite his attempt to maintain command authority. Status report. All ships report status immediately. The responses that came back painted a picture of complete tactical defeat. Ships disabled, weapons offline, propulsion systems neutralized. In less than 10 minutes, The humans had accomplished something that no enemy in Kitharan history had ever achieved. They had defeated an Imperial battle fleet without killing a single Kitharan warrior. Admiral Frackmore, Morrison's voice cut through the reports of failure, calm and professional as if he were discussing a routine training exercise. I regret that this demonstration was necessary, but your people seem to respond better to practical examples than to theoretical discussions. What do you want? Frackmore demanded, his pride warring with the reality of his tactical situation. The same thing Captain Morrison offered you before the shooting started, Admiral Rodriguez interjected. We want to help your people learn that there's a better way than conquest and domination. We want to show you what cooperation can accomplish. And, if we refuse? Thrackmore asked. Then, you remain here, disabled but unharmed, while we contact the Kitharan High Command directly, Rodriguez replied. One way or another, Admiral, your people are going to learn about the larger galactic community. The only question is whether you learn as friends or as a conquered species. Zara-TH listened to this exchange with growing amazement. The humans had just demonstrated military capabilities that made Kitharan technology look primitive by comparison, but they were still talking about friendship and cooperation. They had won a victory so complete that they could dictate any terms they chose, but they were offering help instead of demanding submission. Commander Zara-TH, Morrison said, turning back to her, I think it's time for you to understand what really happened here today. Your people aren't facing conquest by a superior military force. You're facing an invitation to join something larger than anything your empire ever imagined. I don't understand, she admitted. Morrison gestured toward the tactical display, which now showed not just human and Kitharan vessels but ships from dozens of other species, all working together with seamless coordination. 300 years ago, he began, humanity developed the technology to travel between stars. We immediately began doing what your people did when they achieved the same capability. We started conquering other worlds, enslaving other species, building an empire based on military might and the exploitation of the weak. Zara-TH felt a shock of recognition. These humans had once been like the Kitharans? We were very good at it, Morrison continued. Within 50 years, we controlled nearly 24 star systems and had enslaved or exterminated the native populations of half a dozen worlds. We had built a war machine that seemed unstoppable. What changed? She asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. We met someone stronger than we were, Morrison said simply. The Altarians. They had been watching us, just as we've been watching you. And, when we finally pushed too far, when we attacked a world they had taken under their protection, they did to us what we just did to your fleet. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Humanity had been where the Kitharans were now, facing a superior force that could have crushed them completely. But, instead of destroying us, Morrison went on, they offered us the same choice we're offering you. They showed us what we could become if we chose cooperation over conquest. They taught us that true strength comes not from the ability to dominate others, but from the willingness to help others become stronger themselves. And, you just accepted that? Zara-TH asked. You gave up your empire, your conquests, your power, just because someone stronger told you to? We didn't give up our power, Morrison corrected. We learned how to use it differently. Look around you, Commander. This fleet represents more military might than your empire has ever assembled, but it exists not to conquer but to protect. These ships, these weapons, this technology, all of it was developed through cooperation between species who chose to work together instead of trying to destroy each other. The tactical display shifted to show detailed readouts of the human vessels, and Zara-TH realized that Morrison was right. The technology she was looking at was beyond anything in Kitharan databases, beyond anything she had imagined possible. But, it hadn't been developed through conquest and forced labor. It had been developed through willing collaboration between dozens of different civilizations. The gravitational manipulation systems came from the Altarians, Morrison explained. The quantum field generators were developed jointly by humans and the crystalline entities. The spatial translation technology required input from 17 different species, each contributing their unique understanding of higher dimensional physics. You're saying that cooperation made you stronger than conquest ever could, Zara-TH said slowly. I'm saying that cooperation made us stronger than conquest ever could, Morrison confirmed. When people work together willingly, when they share knowledge freely, when they trust each other enough to combine their unique strengths, the results are far beyond what any single species can achieve alone. Admiral Thrackmore's voice cut across the conversation, filled with the bitter frustration of someone whose worldview was crumbling around him. This is propaganda, lies designed to weaken our resolve. The strong conquer. The weak serve. This is the law of nature. Actually, said a new voice, this one coming from one of the alien vessels in the human coalition, nature is far more complicated than that simplistic philosophy suggests. The display shifted to show a creature that was obviously not human, its insectoid features and compound eyes unlike anything in Kitharan experience. When it spoke, its words carried the authority of vast intelligence and ancient wisdom. I am Hivemind designate Zakth of the Hexapod Collective, the creature said. My people have existed for over 2 million years. In that time, we have seen thousands of species rise and fall, including many who shared your philosophy of conquest and domination. And? Thrackmore demanded. And, they are all extinct, Zakth replied simply. Every single species that believed strength came from the ability to dominate others eventually destroyed themselves through internal conflict, resource depletion, or simple stagnation. The only species that survive in the long term are those that learn to cooperate, to share, to help each other grow stronger. The silence that followed this statement was profound. Even Thrackmore seemed unable to formulate a response to the casual dismissal of everything his civilization had built itself upon. Morrison broke the silence with a question that somehow managed to be both gentle and devastating. Admiral, Commander, in all your centuries of conquest, how many of the species you've enslaved have you trusted enough to let them help design your weapons? How many of your subject peoples have you allowed to contribute to your technology? How many conquered civilizations have you given the opportunity to make your empire stronger through willing cooperation? The answer, Zakth realized, was none. 0. The Kitharan Empire had built itself on the assumption that conquered species were useful only as laborers and resource extractors. The idea of treating them as partners, of allowing them to contribute their knowledge and skills as equals, had never even occurred to the imperial leadership. You've wasted the potential of every species you've ever encountered, Morrison continued. You've turned civilizations that could have been your greatest assets into broken slaves who contribute nothing but their labor. You've stunted your own growth by refusing to learn from others. And, in that moment, Zakth finally understood the true magnitude of what her people had lost through their philosophy of conquest. They hadn't just missed opportunities for friendship and cooperation. They had crippled their own development by refusing to acknowledge that other species might have something valuable to offer beyond their submission. 6 months after the encounter at HFY Prime, Zakth stood in what had once been the primary strategic planning chamber of the Bloodfang and tried to recognize the space around her. The walls that had once displayed tactical projections and territorial conquest maps now showed collaborative research projects and diplomatic schedules. The seats that had once held military commanders planning their next campaign now accommodated scientists, engineers, and cultural exchange specialists from 17 different species. The transformation hadn't been easy. 3 centuries of ingrained thinking didn't change overnight, and there had been moments when Zakth had wondered if the humans were engaged in the galaxy's most elaborate form of psychological warfare. But, as the weeks had passed and the evidence had accumulated, she had been forced to confront a truth that challenged everything she thought she knew about strength, power, and survival. The humans had been telling the truth. All of it. Commander, we're ready to begin the neural interface calibration, announced Dr. Sarah Chan, the human neuroscientist who had been working with Kitharan volunteers to develop new forms of interspecies communication. The technology would allow direct mind-to-mind contact between humans and Kitharans, eliminating the barriers that had made cooperation so difficult in the early days of their alliance. Proceed, Doctor, Zakth replied, settling into the interface chair that had been specifically designed to accommodate Kitharan physiology. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to let humans directly access her thoughts, something that would have been unthinkable during her years as an Imperial commander. As the neural interface came online, Zakth felt the strange sensation of another consciousness touching the edges of her mind. But, instead of the invasive mental probe she had expected, she experienced something far more subtle and respectful. Dr. Chen's presence in her thoughts felt like a gentle hand extended in friendship, offering connection without demanding submission. "Can you hear me clearly, Commander?" Chen's mental voice carried warmth and curiosity rather than the cold efficiency Zara-TH had learned to associate with military communication. "Yes," Zara-TH replied, marveling at how natural the exchange felt. "This is remarkable technology. How long did it take your people to develop it?" "Actually, we didn't develop it alone," Chen explained. This is a collaboration between human neuroscientists, Altarian consciousness researchers, and crystalline entity quantum field specialists. None of our species could have created it independently. It required insights that only came from combining our different approaches to understanding the mind, and there it was again, Zara-TH thought. The fundamental difference between human civilization and the Kitharan Empire. Or her people would have hoarded such technology as a military advantage, these humans had created it through willing cooperation and were now sharing it freely with former enemies. The neural link expanded, and, suddenly, Zara-TH found herself experiencing Dr. Chen's memories of the project's development. She saw human scientists working side by side with beings whose thought processes were so alien that communication had initially seemed impossible. She felt their frustration at early failures, their excitement at breakthrough moments, and their deep satisfaction at finally creating something that could bring different species closer together. But, more than that, she experienced something that had been completely absent from her centuries in the Imperial military, the joy of discovery shared with others who cared about the same goals. "Commander," Chen's mental voice carried a note of surprise, "I'm picking up some of your memories as well. The neural interface is designed to be bidirectional if both participants are willing." "Show me," Zara-TH replied, curious about what the human scientist was experiencing. Through Chen's perception, she saw her own memories of Imperial conquest campaigns, but filtered through a perspective that was fundamentally different from her own. Where Zara-TH had seen military victories and successful subjugation of inferior species, Chen saw waste and tragedy on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. "All those civilizations," Chen thought, her mental voice filled with sadness. All that knowledge, all those unique perspectives on the universe, reduced to slave labor and resource extraction. "Do you realize what your people lost? What the galaxy lost?" The question hit Zara-TH harder than any physical blow could have. Through Chen's eyes, she saw the Kitharan Empire's conquests not as signs of strength but as acts of self-inflicted blindness. Every species her people had enslaved had possessed knowledge, art, philosophy, and technology that could have enriched both civilizations. Instead, that potential had been crushed under the weight of imperial doctrine. "We thought we were being strong," Zara-TH replied, her mental voice carrying 3 centuries of accumulated regret. "We thought survival required dominance." "I know," Chen responded, her thoughts filled with the compassion that had become so characteristic of human interaction. "We made the same mistake once. The important thing is that you're choosing differently now." The neural interface session continued for another hour, during which Zara-TH experienced more genuine intellectual connection than she had felt in her entire military career. When it finally ended and the technology disengaged, she found herself looking at Dr. Chen with new understanding. "Doctor," she said, "I need to ask you something that's been troubling me since our first encounter with Captain Morrison. Why did your people work so hard to save us from ourselves? Why didn't you simply eliminate the Kitharan threat and move on?" Chen's smile was gentle but tinged with sadness. "Because we know what it's like to be where you were, Commander. We know how easy it is to confuse strength with cruelty, to mistake domination for survival. And we know how much we almost lost before we learned better. But surely it would have been easier to simply remove us as a threat," Zara-TH pressed. "You had the technology, the military advantage. You could have ended the Kitharan Empire in a matter of days." "Easier, yes," Chen agreed. "But not better. Every species that chooses cooperation over conquest makes the galaxy a little safer for everyone. Every civilization that learns to see others as partners instead of threats creates new possibilities that wouldn't have existed otherwise." Before Zara-TH could respond, the chamber's communication system activated with the distinctive harmonics that indicated a message from Admiral Rodriguez. The human woman's image appeared on the main display, and her expression carried the mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion that came from completing a complex and challenging task. Commander Zara-Th Rodriguez said, "I have news from the Galactic Cooperative Council. The final Kitharan slave worlds have been liberated, and the transition to voluntary association has been completed. Every species that was previously part of your empire has chosen to remain in partnership with both the Kitharans and the broader galactic community." Zara-Th felt a complex mixture of relief and amazement. The liberation of the Kitharan Empire's subject worlds had been one of the most difficult aspects of the transition process. Her people had been convinced that freed slaves would immediately turn on their former masters, seeking revenge for centuries of oppression. Instead, many of the liberated species had chosen to work with the Kitharans as equals, their resentment tempered by the promise of genuine cooperation and mutual benefit. "What about the resistance movements?" Zara-Th asked. The reports indicated that several Imperial commanders were refusing to accept the new arrangements. "Admiral Thrakmor has been leading negotiations with the holdout factions," Rodriguez replied. "It turns out that once he accepted the reality of the situation, he became one of our most effective advocates for change. Having a respected military leader explain the benefits of cooperation has been far more persuasive than any threats could have been." The irony was almost too perfect. Thrakmor, the Empire's most ruthless commander, had become humanity's most effective recruiter among the Kitharan military. His conversion to the principles of cooperation and mutual benefit had carried more weight with Imperial hardliners than any number of philosophical arguments. "Admiral," Zara-Th said, "I have a question that I think I need to ask directly. What do you want from us? What is humanity's long-term goal in all of this?" Rodriguez's expression grew thoughtful, and, when she spoke, her words carried the weight of careful consideration. "Commander, we want exactly what we've said from the beginning. We want partners. We want to explore the galaxy alongside people who share our commitment to cooperation and mutual growth. We want to discover what becomes possible when different species work together instead of competing for dominance. And if we disappoint you? If we prove unable to live up to these ideals? Then, we'll help you try again," Rodriguez said simply. And again, for as long as it takes. Because the alternative is a galaxy where every species sees every other species as either a threat to be eliminated or a resource to be exploited. We've seen where that path leads, and we refuse to accept it as inevitable. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent alert from the ship's sensors. Captain Morrison's voice came over the communication system, carrying an excitement that was rare in the usually calm diplomat. "Commander Zara-Th, Admiral Rodriguez, you need to see this. We're receiving signals from the galactic core region, and they're not coming from any known civilization." The main display shifted to show a stellar map of the galaxy's central region, with pulsing indicators marking the sources of the mysterious signals. The pattern was clearly artificial, too regular and complex to be natural phenomena. "Initial analysis suggests we're looking at a civilization that's significantly more advanced than anything we've encountered before," Morrison continued. "The energy signatures are unlike anything in our databases." Zara-Th felt the familiar thrill of discovery that had once driven her to seek out new worlds to conquer. But now that thrill was tempered by something new, the anticipation of making new friends rather than new enemies. "What do you think, Commander?" Rodriguez asked. "Are you ready to help humanity make first contact with another unknown species?" Zara-Th considered the question and realized that for the first time in her life, she was genuinely excited about the prospect of encountering something stronger than herself. Not because she wanted to test her strength against it, but because she wanted to learn from it. "Admiral," she said, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised even herself, "I think it's time to show the galaxy what Kitharans and humans can accomplish together." As the combined fleet began its journey toward the galactic core, Zara-Th reflected on the transformation that had occurred not just in her people's civilization, but in her own understanding of what strength really meant. She had spent 3 centuries believing that power came from the ability to make others fear her. Now she understood that true power came from the ability to make others trust her. The human who had seemed so weak when she first saw him had taught her the most important lesson of her life, that the greatest strength of all was the wisdom to know when not to use the strength you possessed. And, as their ships jumped to hyperspace, carrying representatives of dozen species toward whatever awaited them in the galaxy's heart, Zara-Th finally understood why the humans had fought so hard to save her people from themselves. Because a galaxy where different species worked together wasn't just better than a galaxy of endless conquest. It was magnificent.